It was the day after my wife's funeral when everything in my life started to feel wrong in a way I can't fully explain. I still remember standing in the driveway of our house in Boston, Massachusetts, holding a folded program from the service, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. My son kept telling me to go inside, but something in his voice didn't feel like comfort, it felt like urgency. He said there was something my wife left behind for me, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. The strangest part was how quickly he stopped talking about her, like grief had an expiration date for him that I didn't share. And then he said 3 words that I still can't forget: healing inheritance retreat. I remember laughing once, thinking it was a bad joke, but he wasn't smiling when I looked at him. That was the first moment I realized I might not recognize my own son anymore. If this story speaks to your heart, take a second to like and subscribe, and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now, because somehow knowing someone is out there listening makes this easier to say out loud. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 72 years old, and what happened the week after my wife's funeral is the moment my entire family stopped feeling like family at all. It all began the morning Daniel arrived at my house earlier than I expected, standing on my porch in a black coat that looked too new for someone who had just buried his mother, and he said, "Dad, I booked a retreat for you. You need to get out of this house for a while." I told him I didn't want a retreat. I just wanted silence, maybe time to sit in my own living room without strangers trying to fix me. But he insisted, placing his hand on my shoulder a little too firmly, saying, "Mom would have wanted this, trust me." I didn't respond to that, because I knew Eleanor better than anyone, and she never trusted things that came with brochures and smiling promises. Still, I got into his car because grief makes you tired in ways sleep can't fix, and I didn't have the energy to argue with my own son in the driveway where my neighbors could see everything. The drive was long, leaving Massachusetts and heading north toward Vermont, the trees getting thicker, the roads quieter, and Daniel barely speaking except to repeat how good this would be for me, like he was rehearsing it instead of meaning it. When we finally arrived at the place called Greenridge Estate, it looked nothing like a retreat and more like a luxury resort pretending to be something softer, with polished wood signs and a reception desk that smelled like expensive soap and forced calm. A woman at the front greeted us too quickly, like she already knew our names, and said, "Welcome to Greenridge, where families come to process transitions and inheritance planning together." I remember pausing at the word inheritance, because it didn't belong next to grief, not in my world, but Daniel just nodded like it all made perfect sense. He handed me a thick folder of documents before I could even sit down, tapping the stack lightly and saying, "Just sign these, Dad. It's all standard, don't overthink it." That was when I first noticed the nurse standing near the hallway, watching me instead of the conversation, her expression calm but alert in a way that made my stomach tighten. I tried to read the first page, but Daniel leaned closer and said, "We can go over it later, just trust me right now." And something in the way he avoided my eyes made the room feel smaller. Then he excused himself to take a phone call, stepping away from the desk, and that was the exact moment everything shifted. The nurse walked straight toward me, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with purpose, and before I could even ask her name, she gently grabbed my arm and leaned in close enough that only I could hear her whisper, "Don't sign a single page, Mr. Hayes, not one." I froze right there in the middle of the lobby, the sound of my son's voice fading in the background, and I asked her why, but she only shook her head slightly and said, "Your wife didn't come here just to be remembered. She left something behind, and if you sign those papers first, you may never see it." And in that exact moment, as I looked down at the folder in my hands and then toward the hallway where Daniel had disappeared, I realized I had no idea why my wife had ever agreed to something called an inheritance retreat, and what I was about to discover about her hidden safe would change everything I thought I knew about the last 10 years of our marriage. The nurse's words kept replaying in my mind as I stood there in that polished lobby, my fingers still holding the folder Daniel had handed me. "Don't sign a single page." It sounded simple, but nothing about it felt simple anymore. I looked down at the papers again, then toward the hallway where my son had disappeared, and for the first time since my wife passed, I felt something that was not grief, but hesitation mixed with something sharper. Daniel came back a few minutes later, smiling like nothing had happened, holding a paper cup of coffee as if this was just another normal afternoon. He said, "Sorry about that. Dad, work stuff. Are you ready to get settled in?" I remember staring at him for a moment too long before answering, because I was trying to reconcile the boy I raised with the man standing in front of me who seemed too comfortable with all of this. "Daniel," I asked quietly, "what exactly is this place?" He gave a small laugh and said, "It is just a retreat, Dad. A place where families handle inheritance planning and emotional recovery together. Mom would have liked structure like this." When he said her name, I noticed he did not pause, did not soften, did not look away like someone remembering a loss. It felt rehearsed, like he had said it too many times already. I followed him down a hallway lined with soft lighting and framed photographs of smiling families, all of them looking staged in a way that made my skin feel cold. As we walked, I started thinking back to my childhood, to the kind of family I grew up in, and how different everything used to feel when Eleanor and I were first building our life together in a small house outside Worcester, Massachusetts. I was raised in a home where silence meant something was wrong, not peaceful. My father, Harold Hayes, worked long hours at a steel plant, and when he came home, the first question was always about my older brother, Michael. Never me first, never even close. I can still remember sitting at the kitchen table at age 10, watching my mother slide a plate of food across to Michael before I had even washed my hands. And when I asked why I always got the smaller portion, she said, "Your brother needs more energy for school. Robert, you will be fine." It was not cruel in words, but it settled into me in a way I never learned how to explain. One night, I remember asking my father directly, "Do I matter less in this house?" He barely looked up from his newspaper and said, "You matter differently. Do not start problems where there are none." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. It followed me into adulthood, into marriage, into fatherhood. When Daniel was born, I promised myself I would never repeat that kind of quiet favoritism, that invisible imbalance that makes a child question their place without anyone ever admitting it out loud. I thought I had succeeded. Daniel was my only child, and for years I believed we were close, maybe even more than close. But somewhere along the way, things shifted in ways I did not fully notice at first. Eleanor used to say, "He is growing into his own world, Robert. Let him." And I did. I let him. I remember small moments now that feel different in hindsight. Like when Daniel would visit and always talk more about business than about me or his mother. Or when he stopped asking about my garden and started asking about property documents instead. There was even a day last year when he looked at our house and said, "This place has a lot of value, Dad. You should really think about how it is structured." I laughed it off at the time, but Eleanor did not laugh. She just looked at him quietly and said, "We are not talking about selling this house, Daniel." He smiled and said, "Of course not, Mom. I am just thinking ahead." Now, walking through this retreat with him, I realized those moments were not random at all. They were pieces of something I had failed to connect. We stopped at a door labeled private consultation, and Daniel gestured for me to go inside first. The room was too clean, too quiet, with a single table in the center and more documents already waiting for me. "Just a few signatures," Daniel said, standing behind me. "Then everything will be easier." I looked at the papers, then at him, and for the first time I said, "Why does it feel like I am being guided instead of helped?" His expression changed for just a second, just long enough for me to notice, before he answered, "You are overthinking, Dad. This is what Mom wanted." And when he said that again, I suddenly remembered something Eleanor had told me years ago during a quiet evening in our kitchen when she thought Daniel was not listening. She had said, "If anything ever happens to me, do not trust rushed decisions, especially from people who suddenly become very organized." At the time, I thought she was just being cautious. Now I was not so sure, because as I sat there with a pen in my hand, hearing my son tell me to just sign and relax, I noticed something else for the first time. A detail I had missed before, a small envelope sitting beneath the stack of papers with my wife's handwriting on it. And it was not addressed to Daniel or to anyone else in this room. It was addressed only to me. The moment my eyes fell on the envelope with my wife's handwriting, everything in that room seemed to disappear for a second. Daniel was still talking, his voice calm, almost rehearsed, saying something about finalizing simple inheritance steps, but I was no longer listening the same way. My fingers moved before my thoughts caught up, slowly sliding the envelope out from under the stack of documents. It felt heavier than paper should feel, like it carried more than just words. Daniel noticed immediately. "Dad, what is that?" he asked, his tone shifting just slightly. I did not answer right away. That alone surprised me, because normally I would have told him everything, asked him what to do, looked for his approval without thinking. But this time I just held the envelope closer to me and said, "Your mother's handwriting." For a brief second, he hesitated. Just a fraction of silence too long. Then he smiled again, but it did not reach his eyes. "Probably just sentimental stuff," he said. "We should focus on the paperwork first." That was when something inside me shifted in a way I cannot fully explain. I did not push the envelope away like I normally would have. I did not immediately hand it to him either. I just kept it in my hand. A nurse passed by the open door at that exact moment and looked at me again, that same steady expression from earlier. She did not speak, but she gave the smallest shake of her head, like she was confirming something only I could understand. Daniel noticed me looking toward her. "Do not let staff confuse you, Dad," he said quickly. "They are here for emotional support, not legal matters." I should have agreed. I usually would have. That is what I always did when Daniel spoke with certainty. But instead I asked something I had never asked him in my life in that tone. "Why are you in such a hurry?" The room went quiet after that. Even Daniel stopped moving for a moment, like the question did not fit the version of me he had prepared for. He laughed lightly and said, "I am not in a hurry. I am just trying to help you avoid stress." But I noticed something else then, something I had missed before. His hand was slightly tapping against the folder he had brought, not nervously, but impatiently, like time mattered more than it should. I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a smaller note and a key attached to a tag that had my wife's handwriting again. The note said, "If you are reading this, then Daniel has already started asking you to sign things you do not fully understand. Do not argue. Do not confront him yet. Go to the storage unit I opened under my name. Unit number 42B at Riverside Storage in Burlington. Everything you need to understand is there." My throat tightened as I read it, because the detail was too precise, too intentional. Eleanor had planned this. Not guessed, not feared, planned. Daniel leaned in slightly. "What does it say?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I closed the note slowly, and for the first time I did something I never did with my son. I said, "Nothing important." He blinked at me, just once, like he was recalculating something. "Good," he replied after a pause. "Then we can continue." But I did not hand him the envelope. I kept it in my pocket instead. That was the first time I had ever hidden something from him. And strangely, it did not feel wrong. It felt necessary. We left the consultation room and walked down the hallway again. But something had changed in how I moved. I was no longer following him completely. I was observing him. When we reached the lobby, Daniel stepped aside to take another call, and I noticed the receptionist watching me again, more intensely this time. She gave a small nod toward the exit, almost invisible. I did not acknowledge it. Instead, I sat down for the first time without being told. That alone made Daniel look at me differently when he returned. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked. "You seem off." I looked at him and said, "I just need a moment." Another pause. Another silence that he did not like. He tried to smile again. "We are close, Dad. Just a few signatures, and everything will be settled." But I was no longer thinking about signatures. I was thinking about Burlington, about Storage Unit 42B, about why my wife would prepare something like this without ever telling me. And for the first time since everything started, I realized I was no longer simply being guided through something. I was being led away from something. And whatever was waiting in that storage unit was about to change the direction of everything I thought I knew. The silence in the lobby felt different now, heavier, like something invisible had settled between me and my son. Daniel kept checking his phone more often, his thumb moving faster across the screen, and every few seconds he would glance at me as if trying to measure whether I was still following the plan he had carefully built. I kept the envelope in my jacket pocket, my hand resting on it without thinking, as if it might disappear if I let go for even a second. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice smoother now, almost overly controlled. "Dad, I just spoke with the coordinator. We can finalize everything within the hour if you are ready." I looked at him and asked, "Finalize what exactly?" He gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think the other person is being difficult. "The estate transition documents. Mom already agreed to the structure before she passed. This is just closing the loop." The way he said it made it sound like something already decided, already approved, already untouchable. And that was the first lie that began to spread into everything else. Because I knew Eleanor. She never closed loops. She questioned everything twice. A few minutes later, another staff member joined us, carrying a clipboard and speaking with the same calm tone. "Mr. Hayes, your son has been very helpful in organizing your family transition plan. We understand this is a difficult time, but this process ensures everything your wife set up is honored." I turned to Daniel immediately. "When did she set anything up with you?" I asked. His answer came too quickly. "Over the last few months, Dad. She wanted stability for you. She did not want you overwhelmed." That was not true. I felt it before I even fully processed it. Eleanor had never once mentioned anything like this to me. Not in our final months, not in her last weeks, not even in the hospital. But now there were people speaking about her decisions like they had been there when she made them. The receptionist from earlier walked past again and briefly stopped near me, placing a folded paper on the table without looking at Daniel. As she moved away, I heard her whisper, "Storage unit first." Daniel immediately stepped forward and said, "She is just staff, Dad. Please do not get distracted." But the problem was not distraction anymore. It was pattern. Every time I tried to focus on Daniel's words, someone else interrupted with something that contradicted him in a quieter, more precise way. I excused myself to use the restroom, more out of instinct than plan, and as I walked down the hallway, I noticed a door slightly open marked administrative office. Inside, I could hear voices. "He has not signed yet," Daniel said, low but sharp. "We need him compliant before he leaves this facility." There was another voice, unfamiliar, calm but firm. "If he accesses the storage unit first, everything changes. You were instructed to secure signatures before disclosure." I stopped walking. My chest tightened. Not from fear exactly, but from realization that I was not part of a conversation I was standing inside of. Daniel continued, "He trusts me. He always has. Just give me another hour." There was a pause. Then the other voice replied, "Trust is not enough if he reads what she left behind." I stepped back without making a sound. My hand tightened around the key in my pocket for the storage unit. Everything suddenly aligned in a way that made my stomach drop. This was not about comfort. This was not about grief support. This was timing. I returned to the lobby slowly, trying to keep my face neutral, but something in me had already shifted. Daniel saw me and immediately asked, "Where were you?" I said, "Just walking." He studied me for a second too long. "We should proceed," he said again, more firmly this time. "Dad, I need you to sign before things get complicated." And then, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I did something I had never done in my entire life when he spoke to me like that. I did not nod. I did not agree. I simply said, "I am going to Burlington first." The reaction was instant. His expression froze, not angry yet, but completely reset, like a system losing control. "What?" he asked. "That is not part of the plan." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every lie around me settle into place. "Then maybe the plan was not mine," I said quietly. For the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately. He just stared at me, and in that silence, I realized something worse than confusion was happening. Whatever he thought was already secured was starting to fall apart in real time, and I had just taken the first step in a direction he was not ready for. The moment I told Daniel I was going to Burlington, something in the air changed completely. It was not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in how everyone in that building looked at me. The receptionist stopped mid-step. The coordinator stopped typing. Even Daniel stopped pretending for a second. Then he forced a smile and said, "Dad, you are not thinking clearly. You are emotionally overwhelmed right now." I looked at him and replied, "No, I am thinking more clearly than I have in days." That was the first time I saw frustration break through his control. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to panic disguised as concern. He immediately stepped closer and lowered his voice. "If you leave now, you are going to make everything harder for yourself. Just sign the documents and we can handle everything properly." I did not answer. I just turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard him say, "Dad, stop. This is not how this is supposed to go." But I kept walking. Outside, the air felt colder than I expected, even though it was early spring in Vermont. I sat in the passenger seat of his car, but for the first time I did not wait for him to tell me what to do. I took out my phone and searched for Riverside Storage in Burlington. Unit 42B. As I typed, my phone immediately lit up with a message from Daniel. Do not go there alone. I am serious. I stared at it for a moment and did not reply. Then another message came. Mom would not want you digging into things she already settled. That line hit differently, because now I knew it was being used as a tool, not a memory. By the time we reached a quiet roadside cafe near the highway, my phone started ringing. It was my daughter-in-law, Melissa. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. Mr. Hayes, she said quickly, her voice tense. Please listen to me carefully. You are being guided into something you do not understand. Daniel is not telling you everything. I stepped away from the table and said quietly, What are you talking about? She hesitated, then continued. He told us the estate was already pre-approved, that you agreed months ago, but I never saw your signature. I never saw your consent. I looked through the cafe window at Daniel sitting inside, scrolling on his phone like nothing was happening. I asked, Why are you calling me instead of him? Her voice dropped even lower. Because he stopped answering anyone who questions the process. Then she said something that made my hand tighten around the phone. He is already coordinating with outside legal consultants to finalize transfer documents under expedited review. I turned slightly so Daniel could not see my face. That is not possible, I said. Your wife's trust structure would require my approval. Melissa replied, Exactly. That is why everyone is confused. Something does not add up. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, just watching the traffic outside the window. When I walked back inside, Daniel looked up immediately. Who was that? He asked. Melissa, I said. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. She worries too much, he said. Ignore her. She is not involved in the estate process. That was the first time I realized he was trying to isolate me not just physically, but informationally. By the time we got back on the road, my phone started filling with messages. First from my brother, then from a longtime family attorney I had not spoken to in years, then from a neighbor who had somehow been looped into something I did not understand. Every message carried the same tone. Confusion, concern, contradictions. Daniel says you agreed to everything. Are you okay, Robert? Why are we hearing different versions of the same plan? I tried calling my brother back. No answer. I tried the attorney. Straight to voicemail. Even my neighbor stopped responding after one short reply. Called Daniel. That was when I realized the circle was closing in a way I could not interrupt anymore. Even my closest contacts were being filtered through him. When I tried to speak to Daniel directly in the car, he kept his eyes on the road and said, You are overreacting because you are tired. That is normal after loss. I said, Then why is everyone telling me something different? He did not answer immediately. Then he said, Because people do not understand legal planning. They hear fragments and panic. It sounded rehearsed. Not convincing. Just practiced. By the time we reached a small motel near the highway for the night, I had stopped receiving new messages. That silence should have felt like relief, but it did not. It felt like something had been cut off. I sat on the edge of the motel bed later that night, my phone face down on the table, completely still. No calls. No texts. No follow-ups. No corrections. Just silence from everyone who had been speaking to me earlier. And in that silence, I realized something worse than confusion had taken hold. It was not just that I was being guided away from something. It was that I had been quietly removed from every conversation about my own life. And now I was sitting completely alone in a room that felt like it was waiting for something I had not yet reached, while everything I thought I could trust had stopped reaching back. I woke up before sunrise in that small motel room near the highway. Not because I was rested, but because sleep stopped feeling like sleep at all. It felt more like drifting in and out of something I could not control. The room was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. No messages. No calls. No new updates. Just a phone that had gone completely silent overnight, which somehow felt worse than everything that came before it. Daniel was already awake, sitting near the window, scrolling through his phone with that same controlled focus he had been carrying since the retreat began. He did not look at me immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but distant. We should continue today, he said. I sat up slowly and asked, Continue what exactly? He finally turned his head toward me. Burlington. We finish what we started. I noticed then that he was no longer trying to persuade me gently. The tone had changed. Not louder, just more certain. like the conversation was already decided and I was simply late to agree with it. I looked down at my hands and realized I was not shaking anymore. That surprised me more than anything else. Because for days, I had been reacting, responding, following, doubting. But now there was something else underneath all of it. Something quieter. Awareness. I stood up and said, "I am going to see what your mother left for me." Daniel did not respond immediately. He just watched me for a long moment, then said, "Dad, you are going to regret going off track right now." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. I walked past him and picked up my jacket. For a second, I thought he might stop me physically, but he did not. Instead, he said something that stayed with me as I reached the door. "You are not thinking like yourself." That sentence should have made me hesitate. Years ago, it would have. But instead, I paused at the door and replied, "Maybe that is the problem." The drive toward Burlington felt different. The roads were emptier, the sky lower, and I found myself noticing details I would normally ignore. A broken mailbox on the side of the road, a faded sign for a closed diner, a school bus passing in the opposite direction. Small things, real things, not conversations, not instructions. When we arrived at Riverside Storage, Unit 42B, I told Daniel I would go in alone. He did not like that. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. "Dad, that is not how this works," he said. "We go in together." I looked at him and said, "No, I go in first." That was the first time he did not argue immediately. He just exhaled slowly and said, "Fine, but do not do anything without me." The storage facility was older than I expected, with metal corridors that echoed every step. The clerk handed me a key after checking my identification, and I noticed she avoided looking at Daniel completely. When I reached Unit 42B, my hand stopped for a second before turning the key. I do not know why. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something closer to acceptance that whatever was inside had already been waiting for me longer than I realized. The door rolled open with a low metallic sound. Inside were 3 boxes and a small wooden chair facing them, like someone had once intended to sit there and wait. On top of the first box was an envelope with my name written again in my wife's handwriting. But this time there was something different about it. Not urgency. Not warning. Instruction. I opened it slowly. The first line was simple. "If you are here, then you are finally out of time to be guided." I stopped reading for a moment, just staring at those words. Out of time to be guided. Behind me, I heard Daniel enter the unit. He did not speak immediately. I could feel his presence before I turned around. "What is that?" he asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked at the boxes, then at him, and for the first time in days, I understood something clearly enough that it did not need explanation. I said quietly, "She was not trying to protect me from losing something." I paused, then added, "She was making sure I would finally see what I had already lost." Daniel stepped closer. "Dad, stop reading that," he said. But I did not stop. My hands moved again, unfolding the next page. And in that moment, standing in a quiet storage unit with my son behind me and my wife's handwriting leading everything forward, I realized I was no longer simply uncovering the past. I was standing at the edge of something I could not unsee. And for the first time since this began, I understood that the silence I had been living in was not empty at all. It was preparing to break. The silence in the storage unit felt different after I finished reading the first pages of my wife's letter. Not empty, not calm, but focused, like everything had been leading to that exact moment, and now I was the only one still catching up. Daniel stood behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, but he did not interrupt. For the first time since this began, he was not controlling the conversation. He was waiting for it. I slowly placed the letter back into the box and looked around the unit again. 3 boxes. A chair. No decorations. No sentiment. Just intention. My wife had never done anything without purpose. That was something I had always known, but only now understood fully. I turned slightly and said, "She prepared all of this." Daniel replied immediately, "Dad, people prepare things when they are sick and thinking emotionally. It does not mean there is some hidden plan." His voice was steady, but I could hear something underneath it now. Pressure, not confidence. I asked, "How long have you known about this storage unit?" He paused for half a second too long. "I told you," he said. "Mom mentioned some arrangements months ago." That was not an answer. That was a shield. I did not argue. Instead, I did something I had not done in years. I made my own decision without asking anyone. I picked up one of the boxes and carried it outside into the daylight. Daniel followed, but he did not try to stop me. He just watched. We loaded the boxes into the back of my old car, the one I had refused to sell even when he suggested it last year. "It is unnecessary for you now," he had said back then. I remembered that clearly. I drove without asking him where to go. That alone felt unfamiliar. We ended up at a small rented house I had kept in my name for years, a place I once used only in summers when Eleanor and I needed quiet. It was still furnished, still mine, still untouched by everything that had happened recently. Daniel walked in behind me and looked around. "You are really doing this alone," he said. I set the boxes down in the living room and replied, "I think I always was." That sentence did not come from anger. It came from observation. And somehow, saying it out loud made it real in a way I was not prepared for. I opened the second box. Inside were folders, old financial records, and handwritten notes organized with careful precision. Not chaotic, not emotional, structured, like someone had been building a timeline instead of a memory. Daniel stepped closer and said, "We should not be going through this without a lawyer." I looked at him and said, "Then why does it feel like I am the only one who was never shown any of it?" He did not respond immediately. That silence again, the kind that used to mean he was thinking, but now felt more like he was choosing what version of truth to allow. Later that afternoon, I received a call from an old colleague from my engineering days, a man named Thomas Reed. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. "Robert," he said immediately, "I heard you are back in Burlington area. Are you all right?" I hesitated and said, "That depends on what you have heard." He paused, then said, "I heard Daniel has been restructuring family assets through external consultation. That is not normal procedure." I glanced toward Daniel, who was sitting at the table pretending not to listen. I stepped outside to the porch and asked, "Why would you know that?" Thomas lowered his voice. "Because he contacted someone in my network asking about expedited estate transitions without full executor oversight." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was shocked anymore, but because I was finally recognizing a pattern that had been forming long before I was aware of it. When I came back inside, Daniel looked up and said, "That was not necessary information." I sat down across from him for the first time without feeling like I was following his lead. "I am going back to work," I said. He blinked. "What?" I repeated. "I am going back to work part-time. I have already spoken to my former company." That was not planned. It just came out. And strangely, it felt correct. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Dad, you just buried Mom. You should not be making major life decisions." I looked at him and said, "I think that is the first decision I have made without asking for permission." That night, I received another call. Then another. A former client. A retired manager. A neighbor I had not spoken to in years. Not family. Not Daniel's circle. Mine. Each call was different, but the message was similar. "We heard you are available again. We thought you retired fully. We would like you to consult on a small project." By midnight, my phone was no longer silent. Daniel stood in the doorway of the room I was staying in and said, "They are reaching out because of me. I helped maintain your reputation." I looked at him and said, "No, they are reaching out because I still exist outside of you." He did not answer. For the first time, he had no immediate response. And as I sat there later that night, listening to my phone continue to ring softly on the table, I realized something I had forgotten without noticing. I was not disappearing. I was reappearing in places I had left behind, and for the first time in a long time, I could see a version of my life forming again that did not require permission, approval, or explanation, only direction forward. The first morning after the calls started coming in again, I woke up earlier than I had in months. Not because of stress, not because of grief, but because my phone would not stop lighting up on the table beside the bed. Messages from former colleagues, old clients, even a retired project supervisor I had not spoken to in over 5 years. Each one carried the same tone. "We heard you are available again. We would like you to consult. If you are taking on selective work, please call us." I sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of opportunity, returning to a life I thought had already closed. Daniel was still asleep in the next room of the rented house, but for the first time, I did not feel like I was waiting for him to decide what came next. I got up, showered, and put on a shirt I had not worn in a long time, a plain light blue button-down that I used to wear to client meetings. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed something subtle but important. I did not look like someone following instructions anymore. I looked like someone returning to a place they once left. By mid-morning, I drove to a small office building in Burlington where an old colleague had arranged a meeting. The building was not large, just a few floors of local consulting firms and engineering services, but when I stepped inside, something familiar came back to me. Structure, routine, purpose. At the reception desk, a woman looked up and said, "Can I help you?" I replied, "Robert Hayes. I am here for the consultation meeting." She checked her screen and nodded. "Yes, they are expecting you. Third floor conference room." I took the elevator up, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed my reflection in the mirrored doors. Not just older, not just tired, but steady in a way I had not felt since before everything began at the retreat. In the conference room, two former colleagues stood up when I entered. One of them, Michael Sanders, smiled and said, "Robert, I did not think you would come back into this so soon." I shook his hand and said, "I did not think I would either." We sat down, and for the next hour, they spoke to me not like a grieving widower or a confused father, but like a professional whose experience still mattered. They outlined a small consulting role, reviewing structural project transitions for a private development group. Nothing overwhelming, nothing forced, just work that required judgment. Michael slid a document across the table and said, "We would like you as senior consultant. Part-time to start." I looked. At the title printed at the top of the page, Senior Project Consultant, Hayes Engineering Advisory. Seeing my name attached to something formal again felt strangely grounding. I signed my name slowly, and when I handed it back, Michael nodded and said, "Good to have you back in the field." Field. That word stayed with me as I left the building. It did not feel like going back in time. It felt like re-entering something I had once stepped away from without fully realizing it. Later that afternoon, I met Daniel outside the house. He was leaning against the car, watching me approach. His eyes went immediately to the folder in my hand. "What is that?" he asked. I said, "Work." He frowned slightly. "You are really doing this now?" I opened the folder and showed him the contract, my new title clearly printed. He read it without speaking for a moment longer than necessary. "You signed this," he said finally. I replied, "Yes." There was a pause. Then he said something quieter. "You are not thinking about how unstable everything is right now." I looked at him and said, "I think I am thinking more clearly than I have in a long time." That was not said to provoke him. It was just true. Over the next few days, I started working again. At first it was remote reviews, reading project files, joining short calls with teams I had not met before. Then gradually, site visits returned. Hard hats, safety vests, identification badges. On the second site visit, I was handed a laminated badge that read Senior Consultant Robert Hayes, with the company logo printed at the top. I remember holding it for a moment longer than necessary before clipping it onto my shirt. It felt heavier than it should have, not physically, but emotionally, like it confirmed something I had been missing without realizing it. A young engineer on site looked at me and said, "You have been in this field a long time, right?" I nodded. "Long enough to know when something does not look right," I replied. He smiled and said, "We could use that kind of experience around here." That evening, when I returned home, Daniel was already sitting at the table. He looked at my badge before I even sat down. "So this is where you are going now," he said. I placed the badge on the table and replied, "This is where I am going again." He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Mom would not have wanted you throwing yourself into work like this." I paused, then said something I had not said before. "I am not doing this because of your mother anymore." The silence that followed was different from before. Not tension, not confusion, something closer to distance forming. And as I sat there looking at my name printed on that badge, realizing how long it had been since I last saw it like this, I understood something simple but important. My life was no longer paused. It was moving forward again, and whether Daniel understood that or not, the timeline I had been pulled back into was no longer centered around him. It was starting to align with something I had almost forgotten existed at all. I was not expecting the call that morning. The phone rang just as I was reviewing a project file at my desk in the Burlington consulting office, the kind of office where everything smells faintly of coffee and printer ink. I glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because in the last few days, every call from him had felt less like communication and more like control disguised as concern. I answered anyway. "Dad." His voice came through immediately, tighter than usual. "We need to talk before you go any further with this consulting job." I leaned back in my chair and said, "I am at work right now." There was a pause on his end. A short one, but noticeable. Then he said, "You are not thinking clearly. You are making decisions based on emotion, not structure." I looked out the glass wall of the office at the street below and replied, "For a long time, I did the opposite of that." Another pause. This one longer. "Where are you right now?" he asked. I said, "Burlington office." He did not respond immediately, and for the first time I could hear something in his breathing that was not confidence. It was calculation. "Stay there," he finally said. "I am coming to you." He hung up before I could respond. That alone told me more than the conversation itself. I sat still for a moment, my hand resting on the edge of the desk, then slowly closed the project file in front of me. Something about the way he said "stay there" did not feel like concern. It felt like containment. By the time I reached the lobby of the building, I noticed two things immediately. First, Daniel was already inside, standing near the reception desk. Second, he was not alone. A man in a dark suit stood beside him holding a thin portfolio folder, speaking quietly but quickly. The receptionist looked uneasy, glancing between them and the elevator bank as if waiting for something to happen. Daniel saw me and immediately said, "Dad, we are not doing this here." I walked closer and asked, "Doing what exactly?" The man in the suit stepped forward slightly and said, "Mr. Hayes, my name is Leonard Briggs. I represent the estate advisory group involved in your family's transition planning." The word transition landed in the air like it had been carefully chosen in advance. I looked at Daniel and said, "You told me this was settled." Daniel replied quickly, "It is settled. That is why we are here. There are just final confirmations." I turned to Leonard and asked, "Final confirmations for what?" He opened his folder and said, "There are discrepancies between verbal agreements and executed authorization regarding asset allocation and beneficiary structure." I did not fully understand the legal language, but I understood enough to recognize the pattern. Nothing here was simple. Nothing here was what Daniel had described. I felt something shift again, not emotionally this time, but in terms of position. For weeks, I had been reacting to him, following him, responding to his version of events. Now, I was standing in the same room as the structure he had built, and it was no longer just between us. It was documented. Leonard continued, "We require confirmation from Mr. Hayes regarding his awareness of recent advisory actions initiated on his behalf." I asked, "On my behalf by who?" Daniel stepped in quickly. "Dad, this is routine. Just confirm what we already discussed." But I noticed something different now. His voice was slightly louder than necessary. Not confident. Covering. I looked at him and said, "You said your mother already agreed to everything." That sentence made him freeze for half a second. Just enough for me to see it. Leonard looked between us and said, "There are also supplementary directives that were added posthumously under legal supervision." I felt the room get quieter even though nothing had changed around me. "Posthumously," I repeated. "From my wife." Daniel interrupted immediately. "This is exactly why I told you not to get pulled into details without counsel." I took a slow breath and said, "Then let me see them." That was the first moment Daniel did not speak right away. Instead, he looked at Leonard, then back at me, and I saw something I had not seen before. Not confidence, not control, uncertainty. Leonard hesitated before opening the final page in his folder. And as he placed it on the desk between us, I leaned forward to read the first line, not knowing that whatever was written there would completely redefine not only what I thought had happened, but who had been controlling it from the very beginning. The moment I read the first line on that document, everything around me in the Burlington office seemed to narrow into a single point of focus. Leonard Briggs did not speak. Daniel did not speak either. The receptionist at the far end of the lobby had even stopped typing. It felt like the building itself understood something had just changed. The document was short, precise, and written in a tone that was not emotional at all, only procedural. Upon confirmation of executor interference or unauthorized representation in estate coordination, all advisory authority is immediately revoked pending independent review. I read it once, then again, slower the second time. Daniel stepped forward and said, "Dad, do not interpret that out of context." His voice was controlled again, but not steady. I looked up at him and asked, Out of context compared to what you told me. He did not answer immediately. Leonard cleared his throat and said carefully, Mr. Hayes, this clause activates only if there is evidence that decision-making has been influenced without full disclosure to the primary beneficiary. I turned the page slightly and saw something else underneath. A signature line. My wife's name, Eleanor Hayes, dated 2 weeks before she passed. Daniel finally spoke again, but quieter this time. This is standard legal structuring. It does not mean what you think it means. I looked at him and said, then explain why I was never shown any of it. That question did not have anger in it anymore. It was just clarity, the kind that does not need volume. For the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Leonard, then back at me, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed he was no longer trying to guide the conversation. He was trying to survive it. Leonard spoke again, this time slower. There is also a final directive attached to this file, only accessible upon in-person verification of the surviving spouse. He paused and then added, which is you, Mr. Hayes. I stepped forward slightly. Then show me. Daniel immediately said, Dad, wait. But it was too late. Leonard opened the last sealed section of the document. Inside was a notarized statement, several pages long, and a final letter attached to the front. Eleanor's handwriting was there again, but this time it was sharper, more deliberate, like she had written it knowing it would be read under pressure. I began reading out loud without realizing it. If this is being read in the presence of Daniel Hayes or any representative acting on his instruction, then the following conditions have already been met. I stopped for a second. Daniel's face did not move, but his eyes did, just slightly. I continued. Any attempt to secure asset transition without full transparency to Robert Hayes is to be treated as unauthorized influence. Leonard looked up briefly and said, that is legally binding language. I did not look at him. I kept reading. Robert has always deferred decisions when pressured by those closest to him. This will be used against him if not protected in advance. That sentence hit differently, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. Daniel finally spoke again, but this time his tone was different. Not defensive, measured. Dad, she wrote that before she knew all circumstances. You are letting a document override reality. I lowered the paper and looked at him directly. What circumstances exactly? I asked. There was a pause in the entire room. Even the receptionist at the far end had stopped moving completely. Daniel took a slow breath and said, you are not in a position to understand the full structure of what she set in motion. I nodded slightly. That is the first honest thing you have said since this started. That was when Leonard stepped back, closing his folder halfway. Mr. Hayes, he said carefully. At this point, your direct confirmation determines whether any prior actions taken under advisory influence remain valid. I turned slightly toward him and said, and if I do not confirm them? He hesitated, just long enough to be meaningful. Then all previous instructions are suspended pending independent review. I looked back at Daniel. He was no longer speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer controlled what would be believed. I placed the document back on the table slowly. My hand was steady. That surprised me more than anything else. Then I said something I had not said in months. Not to him, not to anyone else in that room. I am not approving anything today. Daniel exhaled sharply, but it was not relief. It was recognition. Leonard closed his folder completely. The receptionist looked down again at her desk, avoiding eye contact entirely. And Daniel, for the first time since all of this began, did not give instructions, did not correct, did not redirect. He simply said, then everything stops. I looked at him and replied, no, I think everything finally starts to make sense. The silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was realization, settling into every corner of that room at the same time, as if the structure he had built around me had just been quietly removed, and no one yet knew what would be standing underneath it. No one in the room moved for several seconds after I finished speaking. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion anymore. It was the kind that comes after. Something has already been decided, but no one is ready to acknowledge it out loud. Leonard Briggs slowly closed his folder completely and said, at this point, all advisory actions are suspended pending independent review. His voice was neutral, almost clinical, like he was reading a weather report instead of ending a structure that had been guiding my life for weeks. Daniel finally broke the silence. "This is being misinterpreted," he said, but his tone no longer carried authority. It carried strain. I looked at him and replied calmly. "Then explain it without interpreting me as the problem." That made him stop speaking for a moment. Not because he had no words, but because every word he might have chosen would now require proof. The receptionist at the desk quietly stood up, as if uncertain whether she was still supposed to be there. Leonard gave her a slight nod, and she slowly stepped away from the area, leaving the three of us in a space that suddenly felt much larger than before. Daniel turned slightly toward me and said, "Dad, you are letting outside voices rewrite what we have been working through." I shook my head once. "No," I said. "I am letting outside silence show me what you did not say." That sentence landed differently. He looked at me for a moment and then said something quieter. "You are going to regret dismantling this structure." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I took a breath and said, "I am not dismantling anything. I am stepping out of it." Leonard cleared his throat gently and added, "For clarity, Mr. Hayes, all prior instructions involving asset movement or documentation requiring your consent are now paused until verified by independent counsel." I nodded once. That is exactly what should happen. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked away for the first time since this began. Not at me, not at Leonard, but at the floor, as if recalculating a situation that no longer followed his assumptions. After a long pause, he said, "This was not supposed to become public like this." I turned to him and asked, "What was supposed to happen?" He did not answer, and in that silence, I realized something important. It was not that he had been exposed suddenly. It was that he had expected compliance to continue long enough that exposure would never matter. Leonard stepped slightly back and said, "At this point, our involvement ends until further legal instruction is provided." He closed his case and left without another word, leaving only the two of us in the lobby. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was lower now. "Dad, you are isolating yourself from everyone who was trying to help you stabilize after Mom passed." I looked at him and replied, "Then why does it feel like I am the only one who was never asked what I wanted stabilized?" That question did not receive an answer either. Instead, he changed direction slightly. "You do not understand the full emotional context behind these decisions." I nodded slowly. "Then explain it to me without deciding what I am allowed to understand." That was the first time he did not immediately respond. He stood there for a long moment, then said, "I cannot do that right now." I accepted that answer without emotion. "Then we are done here for today." I stepped past him and walked toward the exit. He called after me once, but I did not stop. Outside, the air felt the same as before, but everything in it felt less controlled. I stood near the curb for a moment before speaking again, not to him, but to myself more than anything else. From now on, I make my own decisions. Daniel followed me out slowly and said, "Dad, if you continue this path, you will lose access to information you still need." I turned back and looked at him directly. "Then I will learn to live without it." That was not anger. That was clarity. And for the first time, he did not follow with another argument. He just stood there, watching as I walked toward my car alone, not because I had won anything, but because something fundamental had finally stopped moving around me without my awareness, and what remained between us was no longer instruction, only distance that neither of us had fully accepted yet. In the weeks that followed, my life did not suddenly become perfect, and I do not think that was ever the point. It became quieter in a different way, not the silence of being controlled, but the silence of finally choosing what deserved my attention. I returned to work fully, not as someone trying to prove anything, but as someone who simply showed up and did the job in front of him. My consulting badge sat on my desk each morning, and I no longer saw it as something that gave me identity, but as something that reminded me I still had one. Daniel and I did not speak often after that day. When we did, the conversations were short, careful, and no longer built on instructions or assumptions. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden rewriting of everything that had happened. Just space. Real space. The kind that does not heal loudly but slowly stops hurting in places you thought would never change. One afternoon, I returned to Riverside Storage alone. The same unit still sat there, quiet and unchanged, but this time I did not feel the same pressure when I stepped inside. I opened the remaining boxes again, not searching for answers anymore, but simply understanding what had already been given. My wife's handwriting was still there in fragments, notes, directions, reminders that felt less like warnings now and more like someone making sure I would eventually stand on my own feet again, even if I did not realize it at the time. I sat in that small storage space for a long time without speaking, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was being pulled in different directions. I felt like I was standing still in my own life. There is something I have learned through all of this, something I wish I understood earlier. Trust is not something you owe automatically, even to the people you love most. Love without boundaries can slowly turn into confusion, and loyalty without clarity can quietly erase your voice before you even notice it is gone. I used to believe being a good father meant saying yes, staying calm, and letting others take the lead when things became complicated. Now I understand that sometimes being a good father, or simply being a whole person, means asking difficult questions even when your voice shakes, and refusing to hand over your judgment just to keep the peace. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt your own decisions slowly replaced by someone else's certainty, I want you to know something very simple. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to question. And you are allowed to step back long enough to hear your own thoughts again, even if it disappoints people who expected you to stay silent. I am not telling you this as someone who has everything figured out. I am telling you this as someone who stopped pretending that confusion was the same thing as love. And to the person out there who feels like their life is being decided in rooms they are not fully part of, I hope you remember this when it matters most. You are not late to your own life. You are not lost just because you are finally choosing to see clearly. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening with patience, and for sharing this moment of reflection with me. If this story reached you in any way, feel free to leave a comment, share where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes hearing someone else's experience is what reminds us we are not alone in our own. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave you with is this. You do not lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in the moments you stop asking whether something feels right. And now, as I close this chapter, I realize the story was never only about what was hidden from me, but about what I had to learn to see again. If you want to hear more stories like this, there are others waiting on this channel, stories of truth, loss, and quiet strength, each one unfolding in its own way. You can choose the next one when you are ready, and perhaps somewhere in those stories, you will hear something that feels a little closer to your own life than you expected.